It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to everybody at this important conference. So what I plan to do in the 20 minutes available is to give you a very, very brief summary of views I've developed in some detail in the book mentioned, Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. Second edition came out last year. And so I'm going to begin with the perspective of ecological economics. I now identify as an ecological economist, so I began my study of economics before that term was widely used. Then I'll talk a little bit about ecological macroeconomics, which I've worked on the last number of years with my colleague and friend Tim Jackson in the UK. Then I'll talk about some simulation work we've done together, outlining what different alternative future paths might look like from which I really believe can choose. And finally, a quick run through of a list of 13 things that we need to change. So when I began my study of economics back in the 1960s, this was a picture that was brand new. I'm sure everybody here has seen this or something like it. And it made quite an impact on me when I began thinking about economics and the economy, because seeing the earth in this way makes you think, well, where does the economy fit in? And when I tried to answer that question with the perspective on economics that was being presented then and still is today, I was left with some serious unanswered questions. So this was
Peter, we don't see your screen yet.
Oh dear, oh dear. Can you see it now?
There you go.
Thanks.
Okay, so I apologize for that, but as Francis said, was learning how to use this technology. So this is the picture I was describing of the planet seen for the first time, my generation, back in the 1960s. So this is how the economy was then being described and still is today in most major textbooks on economics, with firms and households relating to each other through purchases and sales. I make that move. So the firms are selling the goods and services and hiring the land, labor, and capital, and money flows in the opposite direction. We can make that a little bit more realistic by adding in finance, which also is involved in the flow of funds, of course, and government. But as interesting as this is, and it is a very interesting way to look at an economy, when you're interested in its connection to the environment and the biosphere, of course, that's very difficult to see because it's all missing. So in ecological economics, we add in resources, which are extracted directly from the environment. And so we have a flow of materials and energy going into the economy. And because of the fundamental laws of physics, we know that this material and energy is not in fact consumed, it's transformed and then re-emerges as waste back into the biosphere. And if that overloads the systems, the capacity of the biosphere to accept these wastes, then we start interfering with the biophysical cycles, and that can feed back on the capacity of the biosphere to provide the economy with the resources it needs. And all this is happening on spaceship Earth. So this is the way ecological economists fundamentally conceive of an economy. And I would ask everybody, if you only remember one thing that I offer you in this presentation, to try to retain some of this, the idea that the economy is embedded in the biosphere. This gives rise to certain questions, such as, well, how much material do we extract from the biosphere to support our economy? Now, when I say our economy, I'm very much aware that the economies of the world differ tremendously. So I'm generalizing a lot here, talking at this point about the global economy. I'll come down to richer economies, which is the focus of my work, in a little while. But if we look at what happened from 1900 to 2015, we look at the first 50 years, the materials extracted to support the global economy, divided into those four categories that you see on the screen, we see a sort of a steady increase of 1.5% on average per year in extraction of materials. Then look what happened in the second half of the 20th century. All of a sudden, the rate of increase in the use of materials obtained from the biosphere went up at 2.7% a year. And then into the 21st century, it's going even faster. And so it's no surprise, therefore, that all of this material that's brought in, much of which is discharged immediately back into the, or very quickly, I should say, back into the environment. The energy is discharged very quickly back into the environment. It's not surprising that we're now seeing these planetary-wide impacts that have been made well known through the planetary boundaries literature. I won't read them all, but you can see climate change there, this term novel entities, stratospheric ozone depletion, all the way around. And this has given rise to the idea that there's a sort of level, a safe level on which humans could operate on the planet, but we've begun to exceed that with respect to affecting genetic diversity and biochemical flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, and we're getting rather dangerously close with respect to climate change. I'll just add one other dimension to this sad story, and that concerns what's happened to land mammals on the planet. Every square in this picture represents 1 million tons of weight of the species mentioned. In the middle, in the dark gray squares, we have humans. All the light gray squares are different types of animals that really are there because we consume them, we eat them, and sometimes we use them for work. And what's missing from this is wild animals, and you can see the incredible imbalance now between the human presence on the planet and all the other land mammals. Now, part of this comes from the fact that, and this is a long story, I can only summarize it in one slide, that we've come to define progress as economic growth. If economies are growing, it's almost assumed that that means progress is being achieved. And there are so many thinkers, writers, question that, as I do, and that's a big part of our problem, which explains why I've been interested for quite a few years now in how we could run a modern economy, or could we run a modern economy, and what it could do for us if it wasn't growing. And so some years ago, I guess 2010, about that, I teamed up with Tim Jackson, and there you see the two of us working merrily away on our attempt to build models of modern economies which encompass environmental, economic, and social dimensions, and come to give that the name ecological macroeconomics. Now, our latest such model we call low-grow, SFC. SFC stands for stock flow consistency, which really refers to the fundamental financial relationships that apply in any economy. In short form, every expenditure is somebody else's income, and every financial asset is somebody else's financial liability, and we make sure that our macroeconomic model satisfies those conditions, because otherwise it wouldn't in fact be feasible in the real world. So we use this model to explore alternative possible futures encompassing economic, social, and environmental considerations. Just to give you a quick idea of the main structure of the model, it has a submodel showing the real economy. That's the bit that I showed you right at the beginning, where goods and services are produced from land, labor, and capital, where employment happens, where investment happens, and so on. So that's well represented in the model. We have an electricity submodel because we're interested in the feasibility of electrifying the economy with the electricity derived from renewable sources. We have a financial submodel where we have the economy broken down into 6 sectors. We maintain balance sheets for each of them and the flow of funds among the sectors so that we can ensure that the model overall is stock flow consistent. We have a green investment submodel. This allows us to investigate the macroeconomic impacts of switching a lot of the investment in the economy. When I use the term investment here, I mean expenditure on buildings, equipment in particular, and what happens if we divert some of that to green investments, much of which doesn't have a financial payoff, but nonetheless is very beneficial. And then we have a whole set of metrics to tell us how well the whole system is performing, and I'll be drawing on those later on in this presentation. We use the model to examine a number of policy-driven scenarios where we're able to look at things like a carbon price driving the shift to renewables, mandated green investment, covering the whole range of environmental interests, electrification of transportation, a shorter work year, and income redistribution. So what I'm going to do now is quickly describe 3 scenarios for the path forward. One is what it might look like if we try to continue on current trends and relationships. Now, these current trends and relationships were defined before the pandemic, but you can understand them as what would happen if we quickly tried to regain the track we were on and push forward with that. The second scenario is our carbon reduction scenario, where we add into the base case a price on carbon emissions, particularly from electricity generation. We have carbon abatement also from the non-electricity industry. That means everything else in the economy. And we include in this electrification of road and rail transportation. So this is a sort of business as usual economic case, but a heavy emphasis on carbon reduction. And the third scenario we call sustainable prosperity. We push even harder on carbon emissions to get down to net zero by 2040. We switch further from brown to green investment. We increase transfer payments to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty. We have a lower rate of population growth and reduced work hours. And then we can combine these things in different ways. But those are the 3 scenarios that I'm going to describe when I now look at some results. So in every one of these graphs you're going to see, and I'm afraid there's quite a few graphs, but that's a quick way to convey a lot of information. We have the base case in black, the carbon reduction scenario in red, and the sustainable prosperity scenario in green. And you see for GDP, it grows fastest in the base case. It slows a bit in the carbon reduction case. We don't agree with those who say that we can reduce carbon as much as we want, if you like, and it won't affect GDP. We see it coming down somewhat. And the sustainable prosperity scenario, by design, levels off so that GDP in the end stops growing. Now, when this is happening, if the materials used per dollar of GDP is declining, as it has been doing historically, then what this scenario is also consistent with is declining use of materials and energy while GDP stays constant. Here's the unemployment rate in the 3 scenarios. It's a little more volatile in the sustainable prosperity scenario, but essentially it's the same. It hovers around 5 or 6%. I should say, by the way, I should have said this before, this model is calibrated for Canada. We're working on a UK version at the moment, but don't expect, frankly, the results to be hugely different. But the data, and there's a lot of data in the model, is all for Canada. Here's the debt to GDP ratio for all governments, added to look at debt to GDP ratio of government. And you see it's higher with the sustainable prosperity scenario, but it's not so high that it would necessarily give cause for concern. In fact, there are I think increasing number of economists who really question the relevance of this metric for judging how the economy is doing anyway, but I'll let that issue just go by that way at the moment. Some social indicators. We use the Gini coefficient, which is just a measure of inequality. The higher the number, the more unequal the distribution of income is. And you'll see that it's only in the sustainable prosperity scenario that we see a very significant reduction in inequality, because it assumes a large amount of redistribution of income through the government to make income distribution more equal. With average hours worked, again, the base case and carbon reduction scenarios are essentially the same, but the sustainable prosperity scenario is the average annual hours worked, paid work, coming down quite significantly. This is deliberate because it's a way of maintaining full employment even when the economy is not growing and labor is becoming more productive. If you reduce the length of work year, you still have full employment under those conditions, and that shows you how much you have to do in this particular situation. The household loan value ratio is a fancy name for household indebtedness. It's the outstanding loans and households have in relation to the value of their assets. And you can see that there's not much difference between the base case and carbon reduction scenarios, but the sustainable prosperity scenario in fact shows an improved situation for households by this particular indicator. Environmental indicators, well, carbon emissions rise relentlessly under the base case, come down
significantly under carbon reduction case, and even further down to net zero in the sustainable prosperity case. We have a comprehensive environmental burden index. Needs some work, I have to say, but it does capture, because of the way it's designed, all environmental impacts that the economy has. And you see that increase in both the base case carbon reduction scenario, but come down the sustainable prosperity scenario. We've got lower carbon emissions and green investment effect and many other things. As I said, population growth rate is lower in the sustainable prosperity scenario. This is a low growth scenario of Canada when it comes to population. There's low projection, and the base case carbon reduction case, the medium projection. You see here renewable electricity in Canada going up significantly in the carbon reduction scenario, and even more with the sustainable prosperity scenario. Now here's the net lending. Now that's quite interesting. If you divide the economy into the private sector and the public sector, you have to face the fact that for the private sector to save, the public sector has to borrow. Public sector borrowing and private sector saving have to be equal, and net lending has to be zero. This is one of the conditions of stock flow consistency. And there you see in the base case, private sector lending being positive, and the government borrowing of the 50-year projection. It's very similar in the carbon reduction case. It's rather different in the sustainable prosperity case, where by the end of the run, sector or the public sector deficit is close to. I mean, you can't have saving within the private sector, but overall the private sector is not saving. So how does the system behave? Well, we wanted to away from just relying on GDP, of course, that was the whole point of this, but we do include GDP per capita within our Sustainable Prosperity Index as one of a number of variables. It has a positive impact on sustainable prosperity, but all the other things have a negative impact. Unemployment rate, if it goes up, the index goes down. Same with income distribution, the government debt to GDP ratio, household indebtedness, average hours of paid work, and the environmental burden index. If these go up, the index comes down. So now let's see how the three scenarios compare in terms of this broader sustainable prosperity index. There's the base case. Things just get worse, and they get seriously worse as we move into this 50-year horizon. The carbon reduction scenario is better because we're doing a much better job on greenhouse gases, but it's not enough. We still would find ourselves worse off than we are at present. But with the Sustainable Prosperity Index, taking account of all of these factors, we actually can see considerable improvement. I've talked about these things for a long time, and I'm usually asked this question, so I thought I would anticipate that and try to answer it. Is sustainable prosperity compatible with capitalism? Well, here's what Robert Solow, who is the founder, really, of modern economic growth theory, had to say. He says there's no reason at all why capitalism could not survive with slow or even no growth. There's some debate about that, of course, but it's interesting that he would take that position. We used the model to investigate that to the best that we could with what the model could tell us. Here's capital share of income. If under sustainable prosperity, capital share of income was to drop precipitously, then one would conclude it wasn't compatible with capitalism, and that doesn't happen. The rate of profit on capital does decline. People who own capital invest it, and won't be happy with that and will oppose it, I'm sure. But nonetheless, that doesn't. This result itself doesn't tell us that capitalism couldn't continue in some sort of form under sustainable prosperity. And here's government spending. It rises, so we can still afford the good things that we've come to expect from government. So finally, I come to the 13 things we need to change. Lots of people have lists of things we need to change. Well, here's mine. It's not complete, but I think it gives you some things to think about. From the point of view of ecological economics, backing up. We need to think about what success means, what progress means, and we have to have better ways of measuring it. From the point of view of ecological economics, it's clear we have to limit
the use we make of materials, energy and waste, and transformation of land. We have to deliberately reduce our demands on the planet Earth to support humanity. If we do that, we will have more meaningful prices. Prices now tell us some things are cheap when in fact they involve horrendous costs that are not registered in prices. If we have better prices, more informative prices, it will help us get a more efficient capital stock that will be using energy and materials more efficiently. We need more durable and repairable products. A number of these, of course, directly related to consumption, which is a fundamental theme of our conference. Fewer status goods. One person's status goes up because of what they buy, but it's always at the expense of other people. That's not a good thing. We need more informative advertising. We don't, I'm not a great friend of advertising, but I find it very misleading and conjures up images of society unattainable and unbelievable, but nonetheless designed to influence what we buy. We need much better screening of new technology. We're rushing into a future without much say in what it's looking like. This has been said for a long time. We need to be more local and less global. That's been highlighted by the pandemic, where major economies have discovered how vulnerable they are to interruptions in supply lines. Definitely, we need reduced inequality. I only mentioned income. It applies to wealth as well. I talked about why it helps to have a shorter work week and shorter work year to avoid unemployment in an economy that's not growing. But I think there are real positives involved in that. Less work and more leisure. Again, one of the things that I think we've seen from the pandemic, what the uses, creative uses people can make with more leisure. Education for life, not just work. I don't know what it's been like in your countries, in Canada, that we've keep pushing this. We've got to press ahead in educating people for work, whereas there are many other things in life than just work. And there's a lot of rethinking of the organization of enterprise, work, investment, and the money system that's required, and lots of good work going on in that. So those are 13 things we need to change. If we do, it'll help us make this choice. We can continue the base case, striving for economic growth, or we can strive instead for sustainable prosperity. I think the time is very right for a choice. It won't be made by people who look like this character in the graphic. It'll be more likely, and I hope all the signs are there, be made by a much younger generation who have these wise words to the UN in 2019. We are at the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal growth. How dare you? So that's my time. If you want to find out more about these ideas, there's my book, a video, a website, and you can run the model yourself to develop your own scenarios, see mine and develop your own, and get some better ideas about the future. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Peter, thank you very, very much. And thank you for framing your conclusion there around the 13 things to change. It's really an excellent point for opening up discussion, and your talk has already generated some excellent questions there on Whova, so I look forward to posing them to you in a few minutes. Next up, we have Barbara Merka. Barbara is taking a different stance potentially on this topic of degrowth, because Barbara studied philosophy in Italy and Germany, and she is a professor in the School of History, Philosophy and Religion at Oregon State University, and her current work focuses on the role of concrete utopias and social experiments for a social ecological transformation. So Dr. Merka's publications also explore society-nature relations and how the understanding of our relation to what we call nature shapes our self-understanding as individuals and as communities. Barbara, we're thrilled that you could join us. I'm aware that it's very early in the morning with you, so we really appreciate it, and the floor is now yours. Barbara, you can turn your video on and unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
We just lost her.
Oh, well, the introduction was too long, too short. Okay, we'll work on getting Barbara back, and perhaps Peter, in the meantime, would you mind taking a question or two? Would that be okay?
No, of course.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
Okay. We have a question here which is very popular so far, and it's how and in what ways do you see the connections between your scenarios and population growth, Peter?
Great question, thank you. Well, as I mentioned, and I hope to make clear, is that the scenario that Jackson, the population growth scenario that we use in the sustainable prosperity scenario is of stability. And like many other high income countries, population would actually be in decline if it was not for immigration. Now, this takes us into a very difficult area to talk about, but Canada would still need more than 100,000 immigrants a year to maintain a constant population, even in the low constant population scenario. So, and when you look at how some rich countries, if you look at their immigration policy, it's one based on attracting the most highly trained people from developing countries. And this is a very problematic issue from my perspective, because it means that we let poorer countries train engineers and doctors and nurses, and then we hire them because we don't train enough ourselves. I don't think this overall is a very good way to go. So it's a complicated issue. There's strong ethical questions involved, but in my view, a stable population is an important part of sustaining prosperity in rich countries. Now, it's not essential. You could still have a non-growing economy with a gently rising population. It would just mean that the GDP per capita would be declining. Incomes would be declining. Well, that may be a better way to go. That's up for discussion.
Hi, Peter, and thanks again for agreeing to participate in our seminar. As you know, we've just watched one of your presentations, and it has a lot of very useful information in it. And what we wanted to do was to add some additional items. And unfortunately, I have to ask the questions, trying to anticipate what some of our viewers might want to ask because of the time difference in Canada. And we certainly aren't going to expect you to be available at 2 a.m. in Canada to meet our schedule here. The first question I want to put to you is about economic modeling. Now, for most of us, it's kind of a big black box and we don't really understand how it works. So if you could just briefly indicate, what governments typically do with economic models and how yours is different and some of the strengths and weaknesses, just to give us some background to understand, the import of your work.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to be on this webinar. And as you say, 2 o'clock in the morning, not that I couldn't get up at 2, but I couldn't function at 2. So I'll do my best to give you some good answers to your questions. So the first one about modeling, it's really, everybody has a model. Everybody, in the sense that everybody simplifies the world around them in order to understand it. We just can't cope with all of the noise and buzz and information. So the first thing to understand about a model is that it's a deliberate attempt to simplify the world in a useful way, trying to ignore the extraneous items and focus on the ones you think are critical. But when I think you asked me about models, you're going a step beyond that. It's the idea of building these models mathematically and using a computer. That's what I do, and that's what lots of economists do. We do it in different ways. It has the advantage of making your assumptions explicit, at least to somebody else who can look in and see how your model works and what it consists of. That's not that easy to do. Not everybody makes it that easy, but nonetheless, in principle, when we make a mathematical or a computer model, it's there for others to inspect. Whereas a mental model that we all have in our different ways is very hard to inspect, and people just sort of say things based upon their view of the world. And it's hard to understand why they've said it sometimes or what assumptions they're making. So the kind of model I built for the Canadian economy with my good friend and colleague Tim Jackson is unusual in terms of the method we use. We use something called system dynamics. basically we're saying the economy and the environment, that's the two are interrelated, are a set of systems. And so we use an approach which allows us to analyze these systems in terms of two very simple things: stocks and flows. A stock is anything like a water in a bathtub's a stock. Water comes in through the tap, and that makes the stock bigger, goes out through the plug hole and makes it go down. Well, you know, you can apply that to so many things. Money in a bank account. You have the flow of money coming in when you put deposits or interest, and you have money taken out, and then you have a bank balance. So we use this approach. It has a number of features. One is we can handle what we call non-linear relationships. So you can think of something going up exponentially, like population can sometimes rise exponentially. If the birth rate exceeds the death rate, the population will expand exponentially. That's a very important feature of population. It allows for feedback to be analyzed, and so it has a way. It gives us a means of analyzing economic, social, environmental systems all simultaneously, and in particular because we don't have to use a single metric. It's not all done in dollars. So we can have greenhouse gases measured in greenhouse gas emissions, and we can have taxes measured in dollars. So that, I hope, gives you and everybody else on this webinar some idea of what this kind of approach to understanding our situation is all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really helpful. It's good to have that kind of background. Another thing that we had briefly had exchanged about is the issue of declining growth. You made the comment somewhere that there's actually been a decline in economic growth over the last few decades, I believe. Could you clarify that for us and bring us up to date?
Yes. I'm referring to the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's been around for since the early 60s, 1961, I think it was founded. And it's, if you like, a club of the wealthy countries. Jack, I'm going to have to interrupt this. I've got to plug my computer in. I'm so sorry. I thought it was plugged in. Hold on a sec.
Okay. No worries.
Okay. I'm sure there's a moral there in a discussion like this, and energy is going to play a role, I'm sure. So the OECD is a group of about 30, roughly 30 developed countries. And if you look at the GDP growth, either as a group or the individual countries, what you see since about late 60s, it fluctuates, but there's a steady decline in the rate of economic growth of those countries taken as a group. It's there for anybody to see. Go on to the OECD website. Anybody can look at the data, and you see that economic growth in these rich countries are on a downward trajectory. All I do is report that. It's tempting to project it forward, and you put a straight line through this fluctuating bunch of points, and you can, and if we carry on that trajectory, growth comes to a halt in a few years. I don't think that's going to happen necessarily, but that's the trend.
Is there a commonly understood explanation for it?
No, I don't think so. Different people have different things to say about it. One is that for most of that period, the rate of population growth was declining in those countries. So that means that well, it's not straightforward, but there's a relationship between the size of the population and the labor force. And so if it's not growing as fast, but at the same time, you've had a change in the composition of the labor force with more women joining the labor force. So it doesn't move one to one, but that would be one consideration. There's a very interesting book by Robert Gordon, American economist, called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. and it's a 750-page book. He goes into this sort of thing in great detail. He takes the view that the innovations, the technical innovations of the 20th century, particularly the electrification of so many things, can only happen once, and it's happened, and that the possibilities looking in, and he says that that was slowing down towards the end of the 20th century, and of course, when he projects into the future, he thinks it's going to continue to slow, and he thinks economic growth in the US will essentially come to a halt as those trends continued mid-century, if not to zero, very close. So there's also been at the same time a change in the composition of GDP. It used to be more based on goods, and it's gone more to services. And so some would say that it's easier to get technological change and efficiency improvements when you're talking about physical things. But when you're talking about services, particularly if they're provided, by humans, it's hard to make them that much more efficient at the same sort of rate. So many, many things play into this. But the interesting thing remains that growth has been in decline for several decades in the rich countries.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And the question comes to my mind is what role energy descent plays in that, because we also know that there's been declining net energy available from oil and gas in particular, that net energy returns have peaked in prior decades, and that it's projected to peak for coal in the next decade or so. And of course, energy surplus is what allows the increase in GDP. Have many economists focused on the energy aspect, to your knowledge?
Not many, but I can tell you one who has, and who's very well worth reading if people don't know about it, and that's Robert Ayers. That's Ayres, and he has a book co-authored by a fellow called, I think it's Bill Warr or Bob Warr, WARR, and it's all about the relationship between energy and economic growth. Bob is started out as an engineer, physicist, became an economist, so he's got a good grasp of the physical underpinnings. And just I don't know, a little bit of history here. When the early work on economic growth models was done in the 1950s, it was assumed that you'd be able to explain the growth in GDP by looking at the growth in the amount of capital. By capital, we mean buildings, equipment, infrastructure, not talking about money at this point, and labor. That if you've got more labor and more capital, you're going to have more at work, you're going to have more GDP. And what was discovered was that there was a gap. They called it the residual. They said, well, that must be technological change. Didn't have a separate measure of it, needed something, called it that, all right? Well, what Ayers and Ward did was to show that what was missing from that analysis was energy. You can't actually make anything just with a building and labor, not anything of the sort we would think of. You need some additional source of energy beyond human energy. And so they analyzed that the growth of the US economy in particular over the 20th century and say what made the difference was not so much technology, not something, but it was having access to a lot of cheap energy. And as that gets tougher, in the way your question suggested, then you would again expect growth to decline. And just how big a factor that was in the history that I described about the rich countries, I couldn't tell you, but I'm sure it's in their book.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions that occurs to me here is that given this phenomenon and the duration over which it's occurred, how are governments dealing with this? I mean, governments still seem to be pushing growth, and not accepting this dynamic. Is that the case? Are any governments beginning to? I mean, Japan, for example, has not shown a lot of growth, and again, it's specific issues related to Japan. But how, I mean, surely there must be people within governments and treasury departments who were saying, you know, this is inevitable. You know, we have to change the way we structure things so that we can deal with this phenomenon. Is that happening, or?
I couldn't tell you that. I just don't have enough contact with those kinds of people to be able to tell you what they're saying or thinking. But I do occasionally read government documents like budget papers where they'll generally talk about what needs to be done to stimulate growth, or the OECD again, I'll mention them. Back, I think in 2005, they initiated a new annual report called Going for Growth. And each year it comes out, very well worth reading if you want to find out what that sort of central body is thinking about growth. It's all about giving advice at the country level as well as the group level as to what they can do to stimulate economic growth. But it doesn't change the track record of what we see.
Exactly.
So part of your question was, are they still as wedded to growth as ever, or are they adjusting their thinking because growth seems to be slowing down? I can't tell you whether they've adjusted their thinking. I don't see evidence of that in the sort of rhetoric that's coming out now around the pandemic. You know, we've got to get back on track, as if we were on some kind of track that was taking us to some place we really wanted to go to. We've got to get back to it. That's a very debatable proposition, but there's much more of that from what I've seen, at least on this side of the I can't remember where you are, the Pacific, than this is an opportunity to do something very different that will be better. It's more, you know, got to get businesses back running and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a real disconnect between, you know, economic priorities for most governments and the reality that is the phenomenon that's occurring before their eyes. I mean, there are some governments in New Zealand. New Zealand is one that where our Treasury Department has established a well-being framework, and is trying to supplement GDP with a variety of environmental and social well-being measures, and that seems to me quite progressive. Even, you know, it has its weaknesses, but it seems the right direction, and if we can encourage that, it's a desirable thing.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are 4 or 5 countries now that have signed on to this, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. It's a very good initiative.
Yes.
It came out of a group in Scotland, so that is promising. But there's very small economies, and but nonetheless, someone's got to take the lead, and maybe the rest of the world will look to them. Can I just make a sort of a commentary on this? Because you're sort of saying, well, why aren't economists, more generally, governments, if you like, paying attention to maybe things like declining net energy? They are now beginning to pay attention to greenhouse gases, but I mean, it's taken decades, and yet we still haven't seen anything like the action that we've known for a long time will be necessary. Some of this comes, I think, down to the way economists are trained. Economists are trained to think of the economy as a sort of self-contained set of institutions, largely disconnected from the planet. So you can study now environmental economics in an economics department, but it'll be a speciality usually. There might be one class on it. I mean, literally one lecture on it in an overview, but it's not built into the worldview of economists to understand that the economy is in fact a subsystem of the planet, and it lives and dies by the materials and energy it can obtain from the planet, and of course it has to return that energy and materials in a degraded form, because whenever we use materials and energy, we reduce their quality, particularly with energy. And we're overloading the capacity of the planet to absorb what we take. Plus, we're transforming land, any chance we can get, to somehow make it more productive in a narrowly defined sense. Well, this is not the worldview that most economists have. If you do see the world in that way, and then you say, well, okay, the economy is operating within the biosphere, I use that term, then you don't overlook these issues that you're driving at.
Do you think there's you know, a new generation of economists coming along that have, you know, taken ecological economic courses or, you know, biophysical economic courses that are beginning to have an impact, or are there too few still?
Well, definitely there are too few. I no doubt about that. Are they having an impact? Marginally. Most of the economists that I know who work in the area of economy, environment, economy, and energy, less so with energy, but taking that sort of holistic view I tried to describe a moment ago, are not working in economics departments. They work in interdisciplinary departments, multidisciplinary departments, research centers, NGOs. I've trained quite a few ecological economists. I've been privileged to be able to teach in a university, but in an interdisciplinary faculty, not a department of economics. So it's not moving very fast. However, my view of the history of economics is that it changes. The economics that people study and learn and invent changes because the economy they're studying changes. It's not like the physical sciences where the physical world is essentially the same. Doesn't matter when you studied it, but in the social world, the economic world, things are changing. So you keep having to change the way you think about it and analyze it and so on. But there's a lag. And the people who studied it in one way that might have been right for one time tend to sort of stay wedded to that way of thinking and that set of questions that interested them when they were younger and don't move with the times. And that's something that's hard to overcome.
Yes, no, I think it's an interesting observation, you know, that the actual economy changes the theory. It's good that there are these ecological economists, even though they may be too few, but to help us understand, you know, those changes and put it in a very different, broader context, as you say.
Very much so, yeah.
One of the other aspects, of course, of ecological economics is the whole issue of the steady state economy, which is different from a no growth economy in the sense that it's not just that it's not growing, but it's reducing to a level where the material throughput is based on renewable resources and, you know, a stable population and material throughput. I think you've mentioned in one of your videos that your model can handle a degrowth scenario. Can you talk about that a little bit and what some of the assumptions were about how that could work and impact on employment and inequity and so on?
Sure. Okay, if you'll allow me just a couple of preliminaries. When you talk about a steady state, well, you did try to say what you would hold steady, because you can hold different things steady in a steady state economy. The same with degrowth. Degrowth is more than just a different approach to economics. It's a political, social, ideological position that wants us to steer ourselves away from always resorting to growth as a solution to our problems, to recognize that growth can often be the cause of the problem. So it's a challenge to the growth paradigm, if you like. Now, when you model that, either in monetary terms or in physical terms, tons of materials or kilowatt hours of electricity, there's a danger that you lose that broader message of degrowth because you're analyzing things in a narrow, analytical, empirical way. So when you think of a degrowth economy, in that sense, you could be saying an economy with declining GDP, gross domestic product, or an economy with declining material throughput would be the two things can move. I think they generally move together, but they can move along different tracks. So in my model, we use GDP for two main reasons. One is we want to influence people's view of growth in GDP. And if we don't use it, we lose the audience, certainly the audience of economists. Secondly, since we want to build an empirical model, the best data that's out there is actually GDP, not throughput. It's very hard to get comprehensive material flow data. There's more coming out now, but it's not gathered in the same careful, way and with the same resources in it as GDP. So in the model, in our model, in the sustainable prosperity scenario, GDP growth slows down and then essentially levels off. But since the version that I think is in the lecture that you're showing as part of this webinar, I've added materials into the model. And what happens is, in that sustainable prosperity scenario with no growth in GDP, is the material throughput of the economy actually declines. So it's a steady state scenario in GDP terms, and it's a degrowth scenario where it really matters in material throughput. You know, it comes about through a more efficient production processes, which say you get the same service, but you use less materials. That's built into the model. It comes about also from the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Now, renewables are very materials intensive. I mean, a photovoltaic panel or a wind turbine, there's a lot of material requirements. So there will be, and there is even in the model, a big demand for materials to generate energy that we call renewable. But at the same time, you save all that infrastructure and fossil fuels because of the transition. So the model, this is one of the beauties of these kinds of models, is we don't just do what I'm doing now, wave my hands and say, oh, I guess it'll work out. The model gives you a sort of a quantified result. And that's why I can say with some confidence in that scenario, in fact, it's a degrowth scenario in material terms.
Yeah. Can you give us some idea of, in the degrowth scenario, of the relationship between GDP decline and material flow decline?
Okay, well, as I said,
if I remember the...
In that scenario...
Sorry. As we say, I remember the figure you showed in your video of the amount of material flow is something in the neighborhood of 90 or 100 billion tons of material, which is just astonishing. And you know, it's only a small portion of that is renewable. So I'm curious as to, you know, the relation that the model shows between GDP decline and material flow decline.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that the sustainable prosperity scenario doesn't have GDP decline. It has the growth rate declining, but GDP ends up leveling off. At the same time, materials required to support that constant level of GDP declines, largely because we become more efficient. That's as I was explaining a moment ago. And also the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, you actually can get a net gain in total materials. The material mix is very different, but you come out a little bit ahead. At least that's what the model was suggesting. Look, let's not get hung up too much on those particular scenarios. I want to say this, that if we're going to reduce the pressure on the biosphere from now almost 8 billion humans, and of course, we're not all in this equally together. The living standards and so on vary tremendously within countries, between countries. But speaking generally, if you'll allow me, if we're going to lower that environmental impact, we have to reduce our use of materials. And in doing that, that will help us reduce the output of waste. And my approach is we should be focusing policy on those objectives. And if the technological optimists, and there are lots of them out there, are right, it should be easily handled, because we'll find if we deliberately limit the throughput of materials and energy, it will increase their prices, which will give you exactly the kind of financial impetus and incentive that's needed to stimulate innovation in technologies that will save on resources and save on energy. So we tend to go the other way around. We tend to go, let's put resources into generating new technologies, R&D, support the new technologies, put them in place, and that will, we assume, reduce the requirement for materials and energy. The problem with that approach, and there's a whole history of this, every time we make a technology more efficient, it reduces costs. And in reducing costs, it encourages a greater use of the technology. So you get what's called the rebound effect. And sometimes that rebound effect can be so great that you end up using more resources because you've got a more efficient technology than less resources. So if our problem is, as I believe it is, that we're overusing the planet to supply us with the wherewithal for life, then that's where the focus of policy needs to be.
Yeah, I would agree. We need a dramatic reduction in material flow. The question is, what does your model say, or what are your ideas about what the impact of that would be on employment, on equity, on pollution, on some of the other economic indicators in the model? Because some people say that, in order to move to a truly sustainable economy, it has to be a harvest economy rather than a mining economy. And that's a huge reduction in material throughput. Yeah. And so what happens with jobs? What happens with, the material advantages that most people assume it's their right to?
Yeah. Well, again, the benefit of having the model is it generates, if not the exact answer to the question you've asked, but certainly some insights. So in the sustainable prosperity scenario, there's no growth in GDP. And that's what most people understand by growth. So that's a non-growing economy. And as I said a moment ago, at the same time, I forgot actually, the material flow part is in that lecture. That was the first time I think I spoke about it. I'd forgotten about that. So you can see there the graph which shows materials declining. At the same time, employment is maintained. Unemployment, it fluctuates a bit more than in the other scenarios, but it stays around 6%, just the same as it would in the pro-growth, the business as usual scenario. Now, how does that happen? Well, it happens because the model provides for an increase in productivity, just like we've had in the past. We become better at making things. The question is, should we make more things as a result of that, or should we just spend less time working? Well, that's a choice. And people are making, funnily enough, during this pandemic, we've seen people making different choices, not all willingly, but some have, and say that they actually think they've adjusted their work-life balance better. Anyway, that's maybe a bit of an aside. Point is that with increases in productivity, in a sense, we always have a choice. How do we use that? Do we produce more stuff, which means using more materials, creating more waste, or do we keep the level of output more or less constant and work less? So in that scenario, the average time spent at work declines gradually over the 50-year horizon of the model. Not at an incredibly rapid rate. In fact, in Canada, well, I don't think we were very different from other countries at this time, the average work year was declining at a certain rate in the 60s and 70s, and that began to taper off. Didn't some people think work year went up? It's debated. I'm going to say it more or less leveled off. If we were to resume that historic rate of decline in the work year, that's about what the model says we would have to do in order to maintain full employment at the same time as living without any further growth in GDP. So that's what I mean. That's you don't need a very sophisticated model to understand that. Once you realize, as I've said now, but this will be the third time, if we become more productive, we can produce more stuff, we can work less, or some combination of the two. Historically, it's been a combination of the two. Now I'm saying, particularly in rich countries, we have the real option of saying, we'll do it all in terms of increased leisure. Because we're producing enough material things to get as much well-being and happiness from that as that source can provide. There's an enormous amount of literature, as I'm sure you're aware, showing that there's a real disconnect between growth in GDP and how happy people think they are. It plays a tiny role. The relative position that people hold seems to be way more important than their absolute level, and so on. So I think we've got plenty of room here for some imaginative economic and social policy to do a better job.
Yeah. One of the things that I have a hard time getting my head around is the role of energy in this process, because I understand there are arguments, and I'd be interested in your take on it, that a lot of the productivity increases are really about having cheap energy. A little bit of creativity and ingenuity, but the contribution, I think you mentioned Ayers' work, but I think there's others as well, have made the claim that what has really sparked the great increases in productivity have been the availability of cheap energy. And if energy descent is a genuine phenomenon, which many research groups working on it conclude it is, we've declined, for example, from a net energy return with petroleum from 100 to 1 in the early 1900s to 20 to 1 now, and it's on a continued decline. So if can we keep productivity increases that lead to less need for work if we don't have any cheap energy? Or are we going to actually need more human labor as we did before the advent of fossil fuels? Are we going to actually have to work more?
Well, I'm on side with you, definitely, on the idea that net energy is a critical factor in an economy, that the indications are that the renewable technologies that are available now have a comparatively low net energy as compared with the fossil fuels that we are trying to replace with them. And so the question of what does that mean for the transition, the energy transition that we have to make, and what will it mean for the rest of the economy? One concern is that the energy sector will start having to absorb so much of the investment of the economy to produce enough net energy for everybody else, that there won't be sufficient investment in the rest of the economy to sustain anything like the rate of economic growth we've had in the past, maybe no economic growth at all, or maybe even a decline. I think all those are possible, and it's very hard to know. Well, I won't make a prediction as to what I think is going to happen. I will say this, though. I think we should prepare for, if you like, the worst scenario. In other words, prepare for living in a world with declining net energy. And that means thinking, again, rethinking what it is we want to get out of life. What is it we want from the economy? What can reasonably expect an economy to do? You may be right that we will be obliged to use more labor in the past than we've been using. I'm not sure that will happen. I think we've got there's still a lot of room for maneuver in terms of technology. I'll give you an example. I live in one of the worst cities in the world for reliance on the automobile. Toronto, beautiful city, but it was built around the automobile, and so there's a big dependence on that. It's pretty clear, easy to show that if we switch a lot of people out of cars, fossil fuel cars, into electric powered public transit, you can move a lot of people with a lot less energy per person by public transport than you can when you've got 1 or 1.1 person in a car. So there's lots of inefficiency in the system, partly because energy has been so cheap. So I don't know. I don't have a position on whether saying on balance it's the reduction in net energy in the energy production system that's going to overwhelm us, because the inefficiencies that are there are not that great that even if we get rid of them, we can overcome the pressure of declining net energy. That's somebody else's bailiwick to comment on. But I think it's something we all ought to be thinking about, definitely.
Yeah, there are huge inefficiencies. I mean, when you think about the per capita energy consumption in a place like Canada or the US, it's almost double per capita what it is in Europe. It still has a very high level of quality of life. So clearly, we can be happy and have satisfied lives with considerably less energy.
Because their cities weren't built for cars. most of them.
Yes, exactly.
So it was easier to move into public transit than it is in a country where they were built around the car. I mean, the biggest highway near me at one point, I think, had 24 lanes. That's enormous.
I know, it's astonishing.
And it gets
amazing.
jam-packed, and we had to build another. They built another highway because it was so packed. Anyway.
Yeah, which of course fills up very quickly.
Except it's a toll road, so it doesn't. Yeah.
Peter, in the video that we watched, you talk about 13 changes that are needed, and I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about those. I know those you probably wrote those a few years ago. Whether you've had any additional insights or ideas about what the priorities are, and how we transition our economy from a fossil fuel driven one and it generates so much inequality to one that's more compatible with human needs.
Well, okay, I wrote my book Managing Without Growth. It was published in 2007, 2008, and I think there were 12 items there, and there's a second edition, 2019, which has 13 items. It didn't change very much, partly because not a lot was done to act on those goals. And you can find similar lists from many commentators, and they overlap quite a lot. So I don't remember them all, but the first one, which I clearly do remember, was the use of different metrics. That's the term we use, different measures to judge our success. GDP was never intended to be used as some sort of overall assessment of how an economy is doing. The inventor, that's the right term, of GDP, Simon Kuznets, an American, famously spoke before the US Senate committee in 1934 and said it would be a mistake to use national income, which is equivalent to GDP, as a measure of the well-being of the economy. Nonetheless, that's what has happened. There's a history to that, but we don't necessarily have to go into that. But I will say this is one area where there's been some movement over the years. There was a very, very good report done in 2009 at the behest of President Sarkozy of France. It involved Joseph Stiglitz, very eminent economist, a French economist called Fatouzzi. I'm sorry, he's probably very well known, but I had never heard of him before. And the third one was Amartya Sen, another very well known economist and very strong on the ethics side of the question. And they did a thorough review of alternative measures and were roundly critical of relying so much on GDP. So that comes from a very high level. And the OECD I mentioned before, where they're going for growth, they've also done work. They produced a report called Beyond Growth, where they look at other metrics. But there's this terrible time lag. We've got a whole cadre of national income accountants, as they're called, whose job it is to estimate all the statistics that go into GDP. And governments are used to it. People talk about it. There's a familiarity with it. I bet you if you ask 99 people out of 100, what's in GDP, how's it measured, they wouldn't know the answer. You have to study it. It's a bit like a sausage.
One of the things that strikes me about that whole issue of different metrics is that it assumes a different vision of the economy and of a society.
And sorry.
And I'm just wondering if the same way that your model requires making assumptions explicit, are you aware of any visioning exercises that have made some of the values and the goals explicit for a different kind of economy that would not require growth, but give us this human well-being that we're
sure. There's lots going on. I think we can be much more upbeat on this particular subject than maybe this whole discussion has been up to this point. Well, the Wellbeing Alliance, Economy Alliance that we were mentioning before is doing a lot to, people talk in terms of a dashboard. They say you wouldn't drive a motor car just with one indicator. You need several. You don't have to keep putting everything into one and thinking that's all you need. And so so when you start thinking, well, what's important? Well, employment's important. Price stability is important. Inequality is important. So you can have, and there are measures of each of these. And so the very first step that we can take is to say, let's look at this set of indicators and judge our progress against them, and be content with the fact that some will say we're getting better and some will say we're getting worse. And not feel frustrated that we haven't got it all wrapped up in a single number and we can say it's risen by 2% or 3% in the last year. That's especially if you don't really know what it was measuring. So there's a lot of alternative indicators out there. Now in the model, you may recall, we have the Sustainable Prosperity Index, where we simply took 7 items that are in the model, which includes GDP per capita, by the way, but it included the unemployment rate, various debt rates, environmental burden index, a measure of environmental pressure, and so on. And then we add them up. Now, when you add up things that are different, you have to attribute weights to them. That's very subjective. Well, our model, we used our weights, but anybody can, in principle, change the weights to define their own values. It's where you need a public discussion and debate about the relative importance of things. And that's exactly what we get in Canada, I'm sure in New Zealand, around election time, where different parties will take somewhat slightly different positions in terms of priorities. We need to magnify that, make that discussion more well-informed by data, and have it on an ongoing basis, not once every 4 or 5 years. That seems to be the custom. So I'm quite upbeat on this. And by the way, can I just get back to a point you made? I don't think you need the new vision first. I think this is an iterative process. I think when you understand that things are not going that well, and we're relying on a measure which isn't sensitive to the things that aren't going well, you can easily say, well, then let's see what else we ought to be looking at. You don't necessarily change your vision, but there's a nice feedback here, because once you start measuring change in a different way, then you begin saying, well, what do we have to do to get this thing to work better, to get these things to work better, to get people reporting that they're happier more frequently than they're unhappy, to get people having a greater sense of security. Once we're talking in that language and we're measuring those things, then I think you get positive change. I don't know how rapid, but I think it moves us in the right direction. So that's the first item. We've got to measure success differently. By the way, not just in terms of national economics. I think companies need to do that. And I think we as citizens, and we do, but we need to do more of that sort of reflection on what makes for the good life, and strive for that, and not just go after more money.
Yes, well, that's exactly, I think, where we need to focus. That's a really good summing up of the work. This has been extremely helpful, Peter. Really appreciate your availability, and sorry that it couldn't be live for the rest of the participants, but I've certainly enjoyed our chat, and I'm sure the participants will. I hope that I can do some justice to any questions they may put after this recording. So we'll stop the recording at this point. Thank you.